As was mentioned, my presentation is titled Brewin Records, and I'd like to say at the beginning, I do pronounce several words and names in French. I practiced them already, but in my nervousness, if I mispronounce them, I apologize. In his quintessential biography, Bird Lives, Dial Records founder Ross Russell describes the jazzwife, a term that he probably coined, as devoted, doting, permissive, that recurrent tragic heroine in the biographies of so many jazzmen. His depiction is one of two prominent characterizations of jazz spouses, that of the muse and that of the martyr of service of a great man. Although both of these portrayals are in certain situations accurate, they're also both passive roles. The spouses do not do, but only have done to them. Miles Davis's wives have largely been presented as passive. I'm arguing that their contributions were not only active, but significant enough in impact to be considered as members of Davis's management. I'm specifically choosing Miles Davis as a study for Jazzwives, not only in helping him, but also in jazz evolution, because Davis maintained most of his intimate relationships with women who are well established in arts disciplines outside of jazz. That means documentation of their lives are from sources often unaffiliated with jazz, which allows for centered rather than adjacent narratives, with emphasis on the spouse's active work, which also presents different industry biases and often conflicting interpretations of the spouse's influence. In these instances, publicity provides narrative autonomy to a group typically denied it. As Poirot states of Juliette Greco and her left bank contemporaries, you had to be pugnacious in those years if you wanted to exist as an individual and not just as the escort of a great man. Davis's partners largely fit that bill, being highly social, politically engaged, outspokenly progressive, and almost exclusively performers. Why Davis seemed to pursue women of celebrity status only to rip them from a public eye is still a bit of a mystery, but perhaps his opening thoughts on Betty Davis in his autobiography, calling her a big influence on my personal life as well as my musical life, suggest an answer. Concerning Davis's apparent disdain for sexual monogamy, it stands to reason that marriages and romantic partnerships were professionally strategic moves for him. This paper seeks to analyze the results of these strategic moves by examining the administrative contributions of Juliette Greco, Betty Davis, and Cicely Tyson on Davis's career, and present the jazzwife as an alternative to the traditional jazz artist management relationship. We're going to talk about two themes, the first being impact, meaning the measurable, documented changes in Davis's career that are directly attributed to his partner, and influence, meaning expertise Davis's partners had and collaborations they engaged in that may have informed his career and artistic decisions, but for which evidence of a direct impact has not been found yet. So let's dig into it. First, I'd like to talk about Juliette Greco, who in her obituary with the New York Times reads, the grande dame of French chanson who inspired the Beatles and gave Sartre pause for thought. So she's known internationally as the muse and icon of the left bank existentialist movement, but her practical mind and networking and relational skills shaped the jazz scene in post-war Paris. In 1947, Greco coaxed the owners of a local cafe into letting them convert an abandoned cellar below the cafe into a social club. She named it Les Tabots, and it was opened in the spring of 1947, where Boris Vian quickly established a house band he named Les Gueux. Greco says, I sometimes acted as the doorwoman, and I was ruthless, believe me. There were nights when I only let philosophers in. Les Tabots remained open and a mainstay of the Paris jazz community until the late 1990s. When Davis performed at the Festival International des Jazz in 1949, Vian and Greco watched from the sidelines. Davis quickly became a regular at both Les Tabots and Club Saint-Germain, Vian's club. The former likely the place where Greco introduced Davis to Jean-Paul Sartre. Despite their language barrier, Greco served as a sort of public relations agent for Davis, parading him around Parisian jazz clubs and hosting private dinners from her hotel so he could meet figures including Simone Beauvoir, Pablo Picasso, and Albert Camus. This network of artists, existentialists, and theoreticians informed Davis's perception of race throughout the rest of his life. Many historians today suggest that the culture shock of returning to a Jim Crow-era America severely worsened his drug use. On his second trip to Paris in 1957, which included a residency at Club Saint-Germain, Greco arranged for herself and Louis Malle to receive him at the airport, where Malle would ask Davis to write and record the soundtrack of Ascenseur pour les Fous, Elevator to the Gallows. It's possible that the club Greco led the trio to next is where he met his band for the session, who were working with his former drummer, Penny Clark, at the time. In an interview, René Louchraget remembers, the first time we met, we had set the rhythm section up in a basement somewhere in Montparnasse. It freezing down there, and there was hardly any light. Miles came in from New York straight from the airport. It was so cold that he left his coat on. On December 4th and 5th, Outrege found himself recording in quintet with Kenny Clark, Pierre Michelot, Barney Willen, and Miles Davis. Ascenseur today is considered by critics to be the blueprint of modal jazz and Davis's recording style. Stuart Nicholson writes, "What we have is a blueprint for Kind of Blue. Davis experimenting with static and pared down harmonies and rising to the creative challenge of improvising to the film sequences as they unfolded before them in the studio. Certainly the experimental, meandering nature of Mal's film emboldened Davis to take a less structured approach to the score. Greco likely recognized Mal and Davis's procedural similarities when she orchestrated their introduction. Although Greco was doing her own musical work as a chanteuse, she refused to musically collaborate with Davis, believing that they were both too good in their respective genres for there to be any benefit of it. However, Greco certainly shaped Davis's career by networking Davis with leaders of the French existentialist movement and coordinating the album that led to Kind of Blue." Speaking of Kind of Blue, shortly after releasing it, Davis began his first legally recognized marriage to accomplished ballet dancer and original cast member of West Side Story, Frances Taylor. She likely inspired Davis to produce sketches of Spain. However, because time is short, and she said in several interviews that she had no interest in engaging with Davis's career, we're going to skip over 8 years to 1968. At this point, Miles Davis is dating both Cicely Tyson and Betty Mabry at the same time. Betty Mabry is also running The Cellar in Uptown New York, while researching fashion and funk artists with her cohort, the Cosmic Ladies, shown here. We're going to come back to Betty Mabry Davis, but first we're going to talk a little more about Cicely Tyson. So after his very famous funk era, from 1975 to 1979, Miles Davis did not publicly perform, and by his own account, didn't even pick up his horn. Suffering a health crisis brought on by comorbid conditions that were worsened by drug and alcohol use, Miles refused care from several of his bandmates, but did seek help from Cicely Tyson, who he supposedly called from California in the summer of 1978. In her autobiography, she recalls the conversation. "His kidneys were shutting down," he told me. "His lungs were in horrible shape. I'm tired of how I'm living, sis," he said, wheezing. "I don't want to do this no more. Please come back to me. I need you." She said she could not turn away. Tyson urged him to return to New York, and after a minor stroke, she brought him to Dr. Shen, an herbalist and acupuncturist to the stars. It's unclear if he actually had any kind of medical degree. However, he feared Miles Davis had only a few weeks to live, but Tyson paused her work in film and television to manage his meals and medicine for 6 months, putting him on a vegetarian diet and delivering him to Dr. Shen for weekly check-ins. After about 6 months, he picked up his horn again, supposedly for the first time after all those years. Tyson didn't begin taking on film projects again until early 1980 after their engagement. Supposedly during their wedding, Miles Davis leaned towards Tyson and said, "Thank you for saving my life." In this third marriage, Davis did not prevent Tyson from working. Tabloids in the 1980s described them as a black power couple and the king and queen of cool, and photos can be seen of the pair attending award ceremonies and presidential dinners. When she was able, Tyson went on tour with Davis to manage his nutrition. Davis's brief foray into film as an actor also began during their marriage, appearing in television and film productions including Miami Vice, Dingo, and Scrooge. No reports suggest that Tyson created any of these opportunities for him. However, observing her work certainly piqued his interest. Otherwise, he certainly would have continued being involved in film after Ascenseur. When Tyson was unable to join tours, she sent Vince Wilburn Jr. to be mentored by Davis, and in turn, encouraged his sobriety with his presence. Wilburn went on to tour with Davis intermittently from 1980 to 1986, and he now co-manages Davis's estate and licensing, Miles Life Incorporated and Miles Davis Properties LLC. Tyson's autobiography, released 29 years after Davis's death, proposes an answer to one of jazz biography's most intriguing questions. Why did Davis suddenly stop collaborating with Quincy Troupe? Davis and Tyson's divorce was a drawn-out and painful 2 years. Tyson recalls the following as told to her by Barbara Warren, a close friend of Troupe, Davis, and Miles. For months before our final meeting, Miles has been relating his life story on tape, speaking in glowing terms about how I'd resurrected him to life, how I'd nursed him back into his horn and kept him from annihilating himself. According to Miles, said the transcriber to Barbara, I was the greatest woman who ever walked across this planet. Tyson recalls Davis inviting her to dinner after several months of separate living, where he asked that she withdrew the divorce and maintain an amicable but non-physical marriage. Tyson refused. After, Tyson learned through Warren that Davis had stopped returning Quincy Troupe's calls. He apparently tore up his initial transcripts and dramatically altered his characterization of me. It pained him that I would not reverse the divorce process. This behavior by Davis is especially confusing because Tyson claims the marriage began to unravel in 1984. In 1985, Davis interrupted reporter Brent Summers, who was asking about his lifestyle changes and complimenting his healthful appearance, by saying, "Are you trying to say that Cicely changed my whole life? She didn't. She just softened the edges." In that same year, he was supposedly working with Quincy Troupe, claiming the exact opposite in his book. Whether this was his effort to maintain his public persona of the solo genius, or simply a bad press day, is unclear. In either case, Tyson's efforts, which blur the line between spousal support and personal nutritionist, went uncredited by Davis himself. Ooh, talking fast. All right, now we're gonna jump back to Betty Davis. I do want to point out first, though, despite the fact that both of their autobiographies were published by completely different agencies, there's some striking similarity in the cover art. One has to wonder if they were influenced by each other's books. So, jumping back to 1968, Betty Mabry Davis, in my humble researchly opinion, had some of the largest effect on Davis's career despite having the shortest marriage. Although it lasted only a year, their creative partnership likely lasted at least until Miles' reclusion from the public eye in 1975. Although Miles nearly launched her performance career in 1969, Mabry had already been working as a writer, publisher, and agent since the early 1960s. Much like Greco, Mabry launched a private underground nightclub known as The Cellar in 1964. Her former roommate, Denise Oliver Velez, remarked, "Betty not only ran the place, she was the trendsetter and the maestro of the scene." Mabry served as MC, DJ, and booking agent, a sampling of roles that today we would consider creative director. While networking through her artist collective, the Cosmic Ladies, which we showed the photo of before, Mabry pitched and sold her first song, Uptown to Harlem, to the Chambers Brothers, who released it on The Time Has Come. Operating under her own publishing company, Betty Mabry Music Co., Mabry would later write the demo songs that landed the Commodores a deal with Motown, but she took the songs back after an insulting publishing deal. In 1985, Miles sold half of his publishing rights to Warner Chappell Music as part of a new recording contract with Warner Bros., and he claims this caused him to write significantly less. It's impossible to know for certain whether Ms. Davis's experiences and advice influenced that contract that happened over a decade later, but it is clear to us that publishing and major label deals were a popular conversation topic for the couple. Davis says, "Betty was a big influence on my personal life as well as my musical life. She introduced me to the music of Jimi Hendrix and other black rock musicians. She knew Sly Stone and all those guys. If she was singing today, she'd be something like Madonna, something like Prince, only as a woman. She was just ahead of her time. She also helped me change the way I was dressing. The marriage only lasted about a year, but that year was full of new things and surprises that helped point the way I was to go, both in my music and in some ways my lifestyle." Fascinatingly, in most of Ms. Davis's obituaries, the magazine articles choose to quote that entire thing without this last sentence. And I believe that Danielle Maggio explains this phenomenon best, stating, "Due to her association with famous male musicians, the focus from the press was on her gendered, sexualized, and raced body, as opposed to her collaborative and intellectual capabilities as an artist herself. In other words, the press is once again choosing to package her as a passive muse to Davis and Hendrix rather than a collaborator." However, she certainly was a collaborator. During the recording of Bitches Brew, Miles brought his wife in for production consulting. Michael Stratford incorrectly claims that Miles broke his long-standing rule of only musicians in the studio and had Betty at his side, looking for her critical feedback. But this is wrong on 2 counts. Number one, because during the recording of Ascenseur, Jean Moreau, the leading actress of the film, was in the studio, so he was not only letting musicians into the studio. And secondly, Betty was already a well-established songwriter with her own publishing company. She also was a part of naming the album. Betty recalls that Miles wanted to call it Witch's Brew, and I told him to call it Bitch's Brew. He always took my advice. The couple also recorded an album that was meant to be Ms. Davis's first Columbia album. However, it went unreleased, with some critics believing that Miles deliberately canned it. For 47 years, listeners speculated that it could serve as the missing link between In a Silent Way and Bitch's Brew. On the tracks, which ended up being released in 2016 as Betty Davis: The Columbia Years, we found that they were not the groundbreaking the groundbreaking collaborations critics like Chang expected, but rather the clash of two unwavering personalities. On Politician Man's, at the very end, we get to hear Miss Davis rebuff her husband's interruption in the outro, and we're gonna see if this will let me skip to the very end so you guys can hear it yourselves.
How'd you get overdub, man?
That is, they do that on every single track.
Wow.
And Chang argues that there are actually a lot more just sound time that Columbia chose not to release of them arguing in the studio. They both had such strong ideas of how they wanted the music to sound. And of course, Miles Davis was very unwavering in saying it has to be my way. So Betty Davis herself claimed that if the Columbia recording project was released and turned out to be successful, start quote, Miles was afraid that I'd leave him. He thought I'd become a star. He wanted to hold me back in a way because he was very old-fashioned. So the one song Ms. Davis did release that's confirmed to have been a collaboration with Miles is You and I, a meditative love ballad and a jarring tonal and harmonic shift from the rest of her album Nasty Gal, released in 1975. Miles's compositional contributions are obvious, and his trumpet solo experiments with layering of phrases. Oddly enough, he's only credited as a producer and not the trumpet player on the album, although it certainly sounds like him. Ms. Davis used her fashion expertise from her time at the fashion... Oh, it's gonna be difficult with me. Let's go forward, let's not play that again. So, Betty Davis also used her expertise from the Fashion Institute of Technology and her work as a model to spearhead Miles Davis's visual rebrand. She says, I love Miles' suits, but he grew fond of clothes from a place I used to shop at, Hernando's, which had Mexican designs and would custom make items for him. I love how all of these photos are Betty Davis during her modeling career done by an agency, and you can see even much later in life, Miles was still mimicking things like scarves, large lapels, big, bold pattern prints, and fringe. Davis and Davis's conversations around the industry did not end with their marriage. In Stars Starve, You Know, off her album Is It Love or Desire, Ms. Davis sings, they said if I wanted to make some money, I have to clean up my act. So I called Miles Davis. He said, that's because you're a fine black bitch. I said, they won't take what I'm given, so it's hard for me and the band to make a living. Go on and be yourself, man, because I'm suffering for being mine. I'm thinking about bringing in one of them record producers because I'm broke. Listen to a little bit of it right here. So you can hear, despite the struggle she's having in the industry trying to be a woman with her own publishing company and maintaining her songwriting rights, which clearly for Miles Davis was even difficult, having sold half of his, she's still very confident and unwavering in her personality and sense of style. Her lament here, punctuated by backing vocals purring, should have been born a man, predicted her eventual disappearance from the music industry. This album, Is It Love or Desire, which was recorded in 1976, went unreleased until 2009, and the label which produced it dropped Ms. Davis as an artist, likely due to a legal dispute with Lighthouse Records, her former label. In 1980, she retreated from the public eye after the death of her father. And Oliver Wang states, even for an artist as enigmatic as Betty Davis, Is It Love or Desire has been the ultimate mystery. No singles, no promos, not even so much as a bootleg. Later in life, Ms. Davis used a similar aesthetic of silence to Miles, as described by Dr. Ken Prouty. NPR podcast host Jesse Thorne, who was one of the first people who managed to get a hold of her after her almost 40 years of silence, describes his conversation with her as undoubtedly the most difficult interview of my life. Ironically, I reached out to him for this presentation, and he said, man, I don't even want to talk about it. Having been unreachable by the press for almost 40 years, her work is especially difficult to understand as reporters quoted and misquoted each other, which certainly made it easier for the media to portray her as a passive muse, having no one to stand in and assert her active portrayal. I keep forgetting that that's how that works. Technology is not my friend. So by the end of his life, at this point unmarried, Miles Davis seemed unsure how he wanted to approach his partner's roles in his life and career. He briefly acknowledges their contributions in a very vague way in his autobiography by saying, "I was getting by with the help of women. If it hadn't been for the women who supported me, I don't know how I would have made it." But then in a 1989 phone interview for James Kaplan, he refuses to so much acknowledge them. Kaplan tries to ask him about Cicely Tyson, and he says, "What do you want to talk about that shit for? My ex-wives? My ex-children?" So perhaps Greco, Mabry, and Tyson's publicity contributed to the romanticization of their work and their reduction to the passive muse. But Miles Davis's aesthetic of silence, narrative inconsistency, and bitterness towards the end of their relationship, which led to his rejection of the relationships altogether, left their work for a period of time unrecognized.